Unexpected Elements is the podcast exploring the science behind the headlines.
It's a real melting pot.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot happening.
Unexpected Elements from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Welcome to The Inquiry with me, Emily Wither. Each week, one question, 4 expert witnesses, and an answer. This year has been the deadliest on record for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank. In July, Israeli forces carried out their largest-scale military operation there in decades. Focused on Jenin, Israel say the city was being used to launch attacks on their citizens. Palestinians say they're defending their land against increasing expansion of Israeli settlements, illegal under international law. Dressed in black, guns raised in the air, Palestinians in the city have been protesting the violent crackdown. But their chants are not just directed towards Israel. Fight the PA before the Israelis, they shout. They're a useless authority. That's the Palestinian Authority, the governing body set up 30 years ago under the Oslo Peace Accords. They chant about its deeply unpopular leader, Mahmoud Abbas, also known as Abu Mazen. The 87-year-old has a history of health problems, but it remains unclear who will succeed him. A failed transition could plunge the occupied West Bank into chaos. That's why this week on The Inquiry, we're asking, what's next for Palestinian leadership?
Part 1. Fury and Frustration.
There is going to come a day where Abbas is going to leave and people want somebody who's different. They want somebody with a vision. They want somebody with a plan. And the people around him don't have these things.
Dalia Hatuka is an independent Palestinian journalist.
I remember I voted for the first time in 2005. It was a very interesting time. And I remember people being happy about being able to participate in a democratic process.
That was 17 years ago when Mahmoud Abbas came to power. Palestinians haven't voted since. And in that time, their leader has consolidated power.
Over the past few years, he's slowly kind of grown into these other massive roles. So for example, there's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is the PLO. That is the organization that signed the peace agreement with Israel in 1993, and he's the head of that. And then you also have the Fatah faction, which is the ruling party of the Palestinian Authority, and he's also the head of that. And in the words of this young man that I spoke to the other day, I was doing a story, and he told me, he's like, yeah, he's the president of everything.
The Palestinian Authority was supposed to be temporary.
And then the moment which will be remembered, the signing of the agreement and an inevitable response to it.
September 1993, the White House. As the world looks on, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shakes the hand of PLO leader Yasser Arafat. The Oslo Accords are agreed. A peace deal supposed to pave the way to the creation of a Palestinian state. It created the Palestinian Authority to govern the West Bank and Gaza Strip for 5 years, while a permanent deal was negotiated. Those talks collapsed. But the Palestinian Authority still exists, and with it, a controversial arrangement that it shares security coordination with Israel. Israel depends on the PA's security forces to prevent attacks on Israelis within the occupied West Bank and Israel.
So it ensures that people who are basically against Israel in some sort of form are being kept away from, let's say, military installations or settlements or checkpoints, even before anything happens.
While Palestinians feel the PA is doing Israel's bidding and not protecting them.
And they feel like, where are these security forces when Israel, for example, invades Jenin or Hebron or Tulkarem in the West Bank? I talked to several people the last time there was this huge invasion of a Jenin refugee camp a few months ago, and they were saying, where were these PA security forces? And so in the eyes of the average person, the PA is merely doing the bidding for Israel.
There's also frustration that Abbas's long reign has come to resemble any other regional autocrat determined to cling to power.
He's ousted and exiled potential rivals. He's detained opposition figures. He's quashed dissent, both within his own Fatah party or movement that dominates the PA and across the West Bank. And this coincides with the fact that the Palestinian parliament was dissolved many, many years ago. And when you have that, there's no overhaul or no one to look over any of these decrees that he's been issuing. That's a problem. And the judiciary also has been sidelined. His own party has been hollowed out.
Dalia says life now is very difficult for young people, with high unemployment and little hope.
When you talk to young people, they tell you, we have a crisis in leadership, we have a crisis of ideas, because there are no visions on where to go from here or how to improve these young people's lives. There is no national project, no vision, no direction. And so for many of these people, the only solution is to take up arms. And that's why you're seeing these small militias coming out, especially in refugee camps. And, once people have lost hope, they start to do hopeless things.
Part 2. A power vacuum.
It is frightening and worrying because we can do something about it today and we're not. My name is Khalid Shikaki. I'm the director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research here in Ramallah. Most people today, and we're talking about 60% or so, the public, believe the Palestinian Authority today is a burden on the Palestinian people. Only 15% of the Palestinian public say the president should stay in office. If the current president wants to stay in office, he does not have any chance of having that unless he prevents elections. That is why we're not having elections.
With no elections and no talk of succession, the Palestinian national movement risks a power struggle.
This is an issue that the Palestinian media does not want to address so much openly. So this is mostly in social media, in academic circles and so on. And the concern in social media is widespread.
Then there's the rift between Abbas's party Fatah and Hamas. In 2006, the Islamist militant group won legislative elections. Hamas is seen as a terror organisation by the UK, America and the EU. Their win led to sanctions being imposed on the Palestinians and the suspension of foreign aid. After fierce clashes in Gaza, Abbas dissolved the government. Since then, his Fatah party has ruled the West Bank and Hamas has led Gaza.
Hamas is already destabilizing conditions in the West Bank. These conditions in the West Bank today show that the Palestinian Authority is weak. So Hamas wants to take advantage of all of that. And the formation of armed groups is in part something that Hamas is trying to do to create a military infrastructure in the West Bank that would be able to challenge the Israelis today, but also be able to challenge the Palestinian Authority if it tries to disarm or arrest members of these armed groups. So Hamas is working on both fronts politically, by mobilizing the public against the Palestinian Authority, and through force, using armed groups and violence in order to either fight the Israelis and gain public support for standing with the public against the Israeli occupation.
In a transition of power from Abbas, several scenarios could play out, and there's infighting, even within his own Fatah party. Under Palestinian law, if Abbas was to resign or die while in office, the Speaker of the Parliament is supposed to become provisional president and hold elections within 60 days. The Speaker is from the opposition, Hamas, so that move is very unlikely.
We do not have a parliament because the current president dismissed and dissolved the parliament back in 2018. And without a parliament, I obviously do not have a speaker. What you need for the ruling elite to do is to make sure that they consult with the opposition and that they agree to hold elections in 60 days. This is, of course, a difficulty today, because if you can hold the elections in 60 days, why aren't you holding them now?
Unexpected Elements is all about finding the surprising science angles to everyday news.
I love that this show has the scope to discuss both emergent AI, nuclear in Ghana, and also what those stringy bits are on a banana.
And joining the dots between their global connections.
Nature does pack a lot of surprises for us.
An invisibility cloak in the acoustic domain.
So cool. That's Unexpected Elements from the BBC World Service. Find it wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
If there is no consensus, or at least an agreement between the major political factions, on a work plan, on a roadmap as to what happens soon after Abbas, or a roadmap that leads to elections, then there will be a vacuum. That vacuum may not necessarily because no one is claiming to sit in the place of Abbas, but rather because others refuse to accept the authority of that person. The risks here are tremendous because they do involve internal strife becoming violent.
Halil says the lack of a plan that's acceptable to all parties involved raises serious questions.
What happens if armed groups are to take matters into their own hands? Can the security services step in, and who is going to give them the orders to do that? The security services and the armed groups, they both come from the same families, and that would certainly be civil war. So far, the West Bank has not witnessed any major clashes of this sort throughout the years of the creation of the Palestinian Authority.
So who could unify the political groups and gain the trust of the Palestinian people? It's time for our next expert witness.
Part 3. The Top Seat.
I think it's still very much up in the air. There is no specifically agreed upon successor.
Ahmed Haladi is a political analyst and writer on Palestinian and Middle Eastern political and strategic affairs. He believes it's not the who, but instead,
the issue is less about the person than about what they are going to do that's significantly different from what Abbas has done over the past 30 years or so.
There are names out there. One of Abbas's closest aides, Hussein el-Sheikh, is the man many expect will take over. Last year, he was given the number 2 job in the PLO and has been the PA's main go-between with Israel in the occupied West Bank. He's also deeply unpopular. And there are several other contenders within Abbas's divided Fatah party.
You need a leader that has a popular legitimacy that I would argue is not quite the same as mechanical legitimacy that comes from elections. You need someone who significantly represents in various ways the aspirations and the spirit of the people. And that sometimes goes beyond elections. I'm thinking, of course, of someone like Yasser Arafat. He was the uncontested leader for decades through a process of consensus, through public acclamation.
Then there's Abbas's bitter rivals. Marwan Barghouti, who's serving 5 life sentences in Israeli prison for his role in the Second Intifada, is one of the most popular Palestinian figures on the street. while Mohammed Dowlan, who lives in exile in Abu Dhabi, remains a powerful figure in Palestinian politics, with both Hamas and discontented Fatah members. But not a single Palestinian figure enjoys wide enough support from both local and international players.
I think it's going to be very difficult. If you look at the crop of contenders, you will notice a couple of things. Firstly, they're all roughly of the same generation, which is fundamentally the post-Oslo generation of activists from the era of the first Intifada. And they're all now in their 60s and 70s. And they're local leaders. There's no generation that's below that, that's entering the politics of the PA, as it were. I'm not talking about the militants who carry guns or who are protesting on the streets. These are the younger generation, but they're alienated from the political system that has been established in the occupied territories. And to that extent, you have a large gap between the emerging leadership on the one hand and the younger activists on the other, both in terms of a legitimacy deficit and in terms of their attitude and view of how and what to do.
Are there any other opposition parties? Is there any chance for young people with political aspirations to break through?
Well, if you're alienated from the established regime, you tend to take to the streets. And this is effectively what's happened. No, there is no organized force across the territories that represents the aspirations and the fears and the concerns of the younger generation. However, what's interesting is that the old difference between the established political parties and movements, I think, is breaking down. So what's happening with the young militants is that members who technically or formally belong to Fatah are working alongside members of other organizations because they have one common purpose in mind, which is to confront the occupation.
Meanwhile, opinion polls in the West Bank and Gaza show Hamas, an armed militant group, is far more popular than Abbas's Fatah party. That means if elections were to take place, a Hamas candidate could win.
No one is going to really allow Hamas to take over the West Bank, neither the PA, certainly not the Israelis. If there is anything resembling a Hamas takeover of the West Bank, which I think is anyway unlikely, I'm sure the Israelis will move in with absolute force.
But while Palestinian society may be polarised, the national goal remains unchanged: statehood, a point of unity. For whoever takes over, it will still dominate the political discourse.
But I think that we are going to go through a long process in which we have to redefine what the Palestinian national goals are and how to achieve them. There's no circumstance, in my opinion, in which there's going to be a negotiated settlement in which the two sides agree on A, ending the conflict, and B, establishing an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, more or less, which is the formal national goal. The issue is that we've been thinking in the past 30 years since Oslo of a negotiated end to the conflict. That process, in my opinion, has come to an end.
Part 4. A Palestinian State.
Our next expert says we can't talk about a Palestinian state without talking about Israel.
We should not look at the relationship with the Israelis as a separate external sort of foreign affairs matter. All Palestinians are living under Israeli ruling.
Inez Abdelrazak lives in Ramallah. She's the executive director of an NGO called the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy.
We live in a one-state reality where Israel controls Palestinian lives. So even in the PA-controlled area, you have to understand that for anything, import, exports, borders, the population registry, anything from birth to death is controlled by the Israelis.
The coalition government led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is the most right-wing and religiously conservative in Israel's history. And this year, Israeli settlement building in the occupied West Bank has reached record levels. Inez claims it's in Israel's interests to keep the situation as it is.
The Israeli regime is determined to prevent any form of political organizing, and the PA as well. So we're looking, at obviously cyber surveillance, arrests, killings of political activists, arrests of students, intimidations, harassment, prevention of any sort of unions to emerge. And we need to look at that basis before we even talk about elections.
And she believes Israel are not the only ones.
If the international community would have been serious about supporting a Palestinian state, it would have supported steps to reach, Palestinian sovereignty and Palestinian independence, but it has kept not holding Israel accountable. And the international community prefers to maintain the PA's political status quo in the name of stability instead of actually giving Palestinians their political agency and freedom.
Regionally, historical shifts are also underway as Israel's diplomatic isolation in the Arab world is fading. That could have implications for the Palestinian cause.
The path of the US has now been very clear. They're pushing for further normalizing the situation. They're looking for other states to normalize with Israel, and that means normalizing the current situation, in which basically the Palestinians are completely left out and marginalized, whether it's the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. These are countries whose interest is defined by what kind of trade deals and arms deals and technology deals can they have for themselves with the Israelis, regardless of the rights of their own population and regardless of Palestinian rights. But they're, I think, quite aware, especially the Saudis, that somehow it's not possible to do full normalization because their population is against normalization.
Now, it's worth mentioning, Abbas has been in office almost as long as most Palestinians have been alive. The population of the occupied territories is overwhelmingly young. Inez says it's time to hear from a new generation, but they need to be given the opportunity.
Right now, it's clear that 70+% of the population is young and it's below 30 years old. These are people who have never been able to vote. And so, yes, of course, that frustration and that anger is very legitimate and will only continue. So the only sustainable path to that is to offer, is for the Palestinians to be allowed to have, again, a renewed national representation that can challenge the occupation.
So we return to our question, what's next for Palestinian leadership? Right now, succession plans remain unclear. The most likely outcome is that someone within Abbas's close entourage will take over. And while that might mean a continuity candidate is likely, some hope any post-Abbas world offers Palestinians the long overdue possibility of change. Our experts believe the best chance for a stable, peaceful transition is through elections. That scenario is seen as very unlikely. Without them, many fear a messy succession could lead to more violence, or even the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. And without a unified Palestinian movement, prospects for statehood are even further from grasp. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Emily Wither, and produced by Louise Clark. The researcher was Matt Tolson, editor Tara McDermott, and it was mixed by Jack Wood.